Your Excellency, and Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, for us, whether you like it or not, you are the most important guy. That you will agree, sir. Sir, you're the connection. When the ministers visit, it's very important. But we all, at least the two of us, recognize the role of ambassadors. And in any case, we shall continue to recognize that. Your Excellency, welcome to TERI. As I mentioned to you before we climb the stairs, this is perhaps India's both oldest and largest institution dealing with sustainability, energy matters, climate change, and having started work on all this before before they became household names, in fact, before they became names even in the governments. I have Ambassador Dasgupta on my right here, my mentor of many people around here, someone who was involved with the 1992 UNFCCC negotiations itself, and his name finds mention in every single thing. And I remember him telling me that when he was ambassador at our mission in New York, and this idea of climate change came about, he came back to Delhi and said, is there anyone in India who knows anything about climate change? And he discovered two people, Dr. Pradipto Ghosh and Mr. R.K. Pachauri, and went to them and said, guys, we all better get used to this idea. This is not going to go away in our lives. So, sir, let me not take too much time on that, but TERI is the institution which has in various ways nurtured the negotiation postures, the ideas, but in terms of action in India on sustainability and on energy, perhaps there's hardly anyone, although we are a research body. Just to give you one example, we are perhaps the only institution in India which rates buildings. Green buildings is a very big idea in the world. This is the institution which has started it. I don't know where the government and others are on that. On every single aspect, we run a university. There are campuses in different parts of the country. There are business interfaces. And it is, without any doubt, the institution which is therefore highly recognized in the world in terms of when you look at India and outside government in terms of sustainability, energy, climate policies, and so on. And all of us are very fortunate to have been involved with TERI in different ways. Your Excellency, I'll take just a few minutes to introduce some of our key colleagues, and I want to welcome all my colleagues here too. I mentioned to you Ambassador Dasgupta, Dr. Pradipto Ghosh, who used to be Permanent Secretary in our Ministry of Environment, long-term associated with TERI, now on their universities, trustees, and so on. Mr. Rashmi, who's there, also Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Environment. In fact, Rashmi and I share the dubious honor of being their mentees and people who have sat through several negotiations together, including the famous or infamous one in Copenhagen, around the table like this, where President Obama was sitting there and we were the two sitting here. A bit of an honor. I have Shelley, who heads our entire team working on the World Sustainable Development Summit and has been with TERI for a long time. Suruchi Bhadwal, who heads the institutional arrangements that we have dealing with climate change, sustainability, this entire business of the global negotiation. We have our colleague, Mr. Kiran Sharma, who heads the agriculture developments. Arup Malik there, who deals a lot with business. We have Mr. Anshurman and a lot of our young colleagues. Your Excellency, we look forward to an interaction with you to first hear from you, your ideas and what you think, the directions in which the next COP is going, your ideas as the chair of the COP. And we would be very happy to share with you a bit of our experiences. And secondly, a few ideas that we think are important for the developing world, are important for both India and Egypt, and I presume are important for humankind as such. I mean, let me be very clear. We came back to these negotiations after nearly a 4-year hiatus in Glasgow. Many things were thought of and things would happen, but perhaps no one thought that the turn in the global geopolitics would go in the direction in which it has. And today, the fact of the matter is, some of those who used to stand on the tallest podium and announce their climate intentions are rolling back. And this is a fact. But Mother Earth also doesn't stop. The planet is one, and these challenges will continue. And we, especially all of us from the developing world, are the ones who are perhaps facing the greatest challenges, not that the others are not. And we need to see what we can do, and in my opinion, in a collaborative manner. And so, Excellency, let me just say that at least on behalf of TERI, my colleagues here, I can say we deeply appreciate your coming to India. You told us at a function at the ambassador's house the other day that you've been here once earlier for 48 hours. So you were very pleased with those 48 hours. I assure you we will add to making these 48 hours very pleasurable, meaningful and productive for you. Because we believe that at this critical juncture, it is you who helm and who are sitting, let me say, in the most important chair in this particular set of negotiations. Your Excellency, time is at a bit of a premium. I won't say much more. If any of my colleagues want to say something, please do so. Otherwise, I'll request His Excellency to say a few words in remarks, and then Your Excellency, if you are open to it, we can have a freewheeling discussion here. Let me say informal and in that sense off the record, but a discussion by which we will try to share our views with you. But more than that, listen to you as to where you think things are and where you hope to take them in Sharm el-Sheikh. Your Excellency, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Excellency, for the kind invitation, the opportunity to meet you and your distinguished colleagues and members of this panel today. Very pleased as well that our excellent ambassador here is doing a great job, and through which he managed to facilitate this opportunity. And of course, in the presence of the great names you mentioned, either in diplomacy or science, one tends to be more humble than he normally is. And so I'm here to learn and listen and to look forward to build partnerships that could go beyond the preparation of the COP and the event itself. Our two countries have great joint history of achievements in different fronts, including in diplomacy and international cooperation. What we need to see more of is in areas of science and development, and we commend the pace that India is exploring options to the future and embracing science, technology to lead its way for development and progress. Having said that, let me just explain more what I'm doing in my capacity as climate champion. The Marrakesh Partnership gives us this ambitious title that has been raising expectations. I wish that they would have called it something like a coordinator of the non-state actors, which is effectively the case. So our job as climate champions, we deal with all of the non-state actors' activities, including research centers, think tanks, business sector, all of the bodies and entities which do not really get themselves into negotiations. And that for that as well, we have some government bodies like municipalities and regional bodies as well. So everything under the sun, beyond what's happening under the leadership of the negotiators, and of course, the COP in Egypt is led by our Minister of Foreign Affairs as the president of the COP. and under the auspices and direction of the President of the Republic. There is a national committee as well led by the Prime Minister. It has many of the cabinet members in it, including the Minister of Environment, who is doing the work as an international coordinator. I work very closely with the state actors, given my background as a cabinet minister, and now as well with my affiliation with different international organizations. But I'm speaking to you today in my capacity as a climate champion. And I'm happy that your School of Advanced Studies is a member of the Race to Zero. As you know, the climate champions and the Marrakesh partnership within the UNFCCC has three campaigns. One of them is Race to Zero, in which we have something like 11,000 members. We have as well the Race to Resilience, which is the equivalent of adaptation efforts in the formal language of the Paris Agreement. And we have the race, another race, which is basically about mobilizing finance as coordinated by the GFANZ, which is the Global Financial Sector Alliance for Net Zero, that have been launched before Glasgow, with good coordination as well with some of the emerging markets countries, because they were keen, while they started globally, they were keen to have a chapter in Asia, which is led by my good friend Ravi Menon, who is the chair of the Singapore Stock Exchange. We established a couple of weeks ago a chapter for Africa, which I was requested to lead, which I'm doing as well in addition to this work. So this is the simple institutional structure. What are we preparing for the COP this year? And with the presence of diplomats and international political economy experts, and just be very much brief, that the world in Paris is very different from the world that we saw in Glasgow. And today, though that we are only less than a year from Glasgow, the world is very different in terms of the geopolitical tensions, the impact of the war in the Ukraine, the repercussions of this geopolitical crisis, alongside with the impact of COVID on the global economy. And it's basically, as some people would say, it's a crisis upon crisis that we need to deal with. A health one, and then a geopolitical one, and then of course we have food shortages. Those matters are improving recently through good international cooperation with the leadership of the UN, but the food price is still much higher than what they used to be last year. And then of course we have the energy challenge. So one good approach, and I'm happy that the emphasis of the organizers of COP27 had been on the holistic approach to climate action. And to tell you the truth, I think the issue of sustainability had been led and to some extent hijacked as well in terms of priorities by some of the advanced economies that had solved many of the development challenges, including investment in human capital, education, health. They managed to reduce poverty. They managed to have access to electricity to every citizen. They managed to improve matters better when it comes to gender. So it was really expected from them to say, well, we did all of that, let's focus on climate. And they reduced sustainability to mean only climate action, but they took it from a very narrow perspective to mean only decarbonization and dealing with emissions. I'm not undermining the importance of dealing with the carbon emissions. And this is one of the main things that we are fighting for, and we're trying to get serious investments as well to solve the problems attached to them. But it's proper, especially in the developing economies, to put these efforts within a more holistic approach. And that holistic approach doesn't mean just to get the Paris Agreement operationalized with its aspects related to mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance, but to put that more within sustainable development agenda. This means fighting poverty, getting investment in human capital properly, health and education. There is no use of a climate action effort that would result in more poverty or more unemployment. So the issue of just transition for us in developing economies do not just mean some nice words, but is basically dealing with the issues of today while we are trying to deal with the potential crises for the future with the climate challenge. I think that holistic approach is useful because all of us in the same year of 2015, as we signed Paris Agreement in December, a couple of months before that, there was a special event during ANGA in 2015, where the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals had been blessed. 2 months before that, in Addis, there was a Finance for Development framework in July that was blessed as well. So that year was very much important, and we don't need to take an agreement and leave the others. And biodiversity as well is very much important as we do our utmost effort, as we should, in climate. We shouldn't be forgetting about biodiversity and care for nature. So that holistic approach, you'll be finding it not just in the words, but in the way, if you are checking your website, the portal for COP27, you'll be seeing the agenda outlined as such from the leaders' 2 days summit in its sessions. It had this kind of comprehensive approach. We have a finance day, and then we have thematic days covering every aspect that I just mentioned, from mitigation to adaptation, but being more specific in areas related to agriculture, food, water management, energy, aspects related to gender, role of cities. And then we have many initiatives for the first time, and you may appreciate that because I appreciate the work of India in some of the work that you are doing with a regional dimension, and great work that you are doing as well with localization. So we're doing both regional work and localization for them. Of all of that, and you may have heard it before from different speakers organizing the COP, it's basically about implementation, because we have a great body of documents, agreements, frameworks, bylaws, to operational manuals that could fill easily this room if you print their documents and explanatory documents and all of that. What is really missing is implementation. And implementation requires 3 things. First is the work that you are doing here: science, evidence, data, information, and knowledge. And your work here is very much appreciated for it to lead our understanding of priorities, allocate resources properly, and to get our act together in partnerships between government, private sector, and civil society. This is the first starting point. And I would emphasize the importance of data and information to guide policies on that. The second element is basically about institutions and policies that are required in order to carry forward the implementation. Without adequate policy coordination and efficiency and effectiveness of the institutions, many of the scientists and experts and the information could be really go missing in action if you don't really have the institution capacity, especially at what they call the last mile. And that's why we're talking about delivery, issues related to localization, and effectiveness of policies. Then the final thing, and I may spend just a few minutes on that, is basically finance. And here I like to say the following, that the starting point of the 100 billion is a moral issue more than it is a finance or a funding matter. The 100 billion that came from Copenhagen is a promise of advanced economies. I say it to say, well, we're sorry for the mess that we caused to this world since the first industrial revolution, and we're going to try to fix it by $100 billion. It was not sufficient then, and definitely it's not sufficient now. And actually the 100 billion, if it is delivered in full, it will not cover more than 3% of the requirements of climate action for developing economies and emerging markets. But we still insist on them because they are very much important, these funds, for low-income countries, for leveraging the private sector, for supporting development financing institution. And definitely, we use that as a token of trust. Because if you cannot really trust what you promise of a smaller amount of money, now people are talking about finance for post-2025, and there have been different figures floating around, including $1 trillion. We heard that day before yesterday when we had a meeting with the CWW with Dr. Ghosh and his team. There is a figure that you'll be seeing Prime Minister Motley of Barbados, and she was, as always, very eloquent in presenting the case of developing economies and small states, talking about $2 trillion. That includes development finance as well, not just climate finance. $2 trillion per annum. That is basically going to be required. Who's going to be providing this kind of finance in this kind of geopolitics with the rise of the right, of the political parties in power in some of the advanced economies? I would say, well, we need to keep insisting on the funds, but we need to be innovative as well. As it happened in the case of India, for instance, you are not dependent on how handouts and assistance coming from abroad. The heavy lifting of this country is coming through domestic resource mobilization, partnership with the private sector, and encouraging foreign direct investment to partner, in addition to whatever could come as well from concessional finance. And this is the way that many middle-income countries learn to do, not to wait forever for funds that will never come. If they come, that will be great. But if they don't come, and it doesn't seem in this geopolitics, they are not going to be coming easily. So I think we need to think of how to mobilize finance better domestically, align it to the priority projects, encourage the private sector to do more, encourage FDI and external finance, and encourage the development finance institutions to do a better job than what they are doing now, including providing climate finance in concessional terms. It is not fair for countries that are victims of the high emissions to be asked to borrow more for mitigation, or definitely it's not even unfair for these countries to be asked to borrow more for adaptation, which is basically adapting to some of the problems caused to you by others or caused to us by others. The loss and damage file is a tricky one, and that needs special attention, and we hope to have some sort of a progress in that one, because what we have been seeing around in Bangladesh and Pakistan recently in some advanced economies, including Europe and the US, give rise to the importance of the loss and damage. That will not be solved by dealing with mitigation and adaptation. It's a completely different file, and those who are asking us to consider it as part of adaptation, either they know and they mislead us, or they are themselves misled and they just say, well, let's get that done under the adaptation portfolio, which doesn't have its own adequate resources anyway. So that needs really some sort of serious attention to be given to it. On finance, we need to rely less on debt, and we need to enhance the role of the private sector. Carbon credit markets could be an area of work. I'm happy in my meetings during the last couple of days, we managed to see a huge interest by Indian experts in this area. Debt reduction mechanisms through swaps and investing the proceeds into investments in nature and climate have been proven well when they are designed properly to support our actions in the climate area. We need to do better in ESG finance, including dealing with the problems of greenwashing. And finally, we need to consider how can we align the budgets of the state at the central level and at the subnational level to support the climate agenda. So all of these matters and more are reflected in the two agendas waiting for you in Sharm. The state one that is already available in the portal, and the non-state or the Marrakesh partnership that goes in parallel with the state agenda. So it'll be very busy if you are in Sharm and following the news coming from there. I look forward to welcome you all there, but definitely I welcome your comments, your guidance, your views, and your proposals for a successful COP. And as you know, by the COP rules, our work starts and doesn't end with the COP. So we have a full year until we deliver the COP to our friends and brothers in the UAE in November 2023. So we hope to get your list of priorities, your suggestions, and your reactions, of course, to anything I said that you may agree or you may disagree with. Thank you so much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much. And thank you particularly for this comprehensive, if I may say so, roundup for what you expect on the agenda and what you are preparing yourself for. For me, it was music to hear of sustainability and a holistic approach, not just decarbonization. You also mentioned the issues of finance. And frankly speaking, I think there is an understanding among lots, not just because of the geopolitics. After all, 2009 was a long time back when the geopolitics was very different. Democrat administration in the United States. And yet it didn't happen. Realities are such that when it comes to actually paying out, things become very different, especially when the numbers are of a very different order. Your Excellency, would you like to say something, sir? Or
is that I'm humbled being here among experts such as you yourself, Ambassador Manjeev, and Ambassador Mr. Dasgupta and Mr. Ghosh. Equally humbled by being here with our expert and champion of COP27, Dr. Mohieldin, to the extent that I cannot anything to say except that I'm very proud to be among you here. It's my second time to be in TERI, and I enjoyed it last time very much, and I thought that it would be extremely relevant for Dr. Mohieldin to come and see for himself what TERI is doing for the environment and what we can actually do together to champion the cause of climate change. So one more time, thank you very much for having us here, and I'm very proud to have Dr. Mohieldin as a champion of our COP27, and also very proud to be among you all. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Excellency. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you are the principal conduit, word used in a very positive sense. I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues, Excellency. You mentioned several things, agriculture, health, several of these aspects. So let me, first say, whoever wants to speak, I have no hesitation, just indicate. Otherwise, I'm going to start by asking our distinguished fellow emeritus and mentor to most of us, Dr. Ambassador Dasgupta, to say a few words. In the past few days, as we've discussed your visits, some of the points that you mentioned were exactly the points that he mentioned to me. And sir, may I ask you to initiate a discussion, and then we'll take it around among us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, may I thank you, Mr. Mohieldin, for the very lucid account you gave of the current state of play. You outlined all the principal issues and basically how we should go about dealing with these. You made the very important point that there's no realistic hope of the developed countries fulfilling their pledge for $100 billion per year. And we have to turn more to private financial flows, stimulating domestic investments in adaptation and so on. But would you agree, sir, that we do not want to let the developing countries off the hook, to give them an excuse for inaction? And therefore, we need to draw a clear distinction between grant and concessional flows on the one hand, and the $100 billion should refer to that, and to other financial flows, including normal commercial investment flows, raising domestic capital, private sector, etc., etc. That the two issues should not be got confused, so that there's no alibi given to developing countries for failing to meet their obligations? That's a question I have to you, sir.
Sir, let me turn to one of our younger colleagues, sir. So, Kiran, you heard the climate champion talk about agriculture. Now, for all of us coming from India and in fact large parts of the developing world, forget this Ukraine issue. The issues of what climate change would mean for agriculture production, and given the facts of rising population, rising demand, why not? What is a thing that you think they should start at least putting on the table?
Thanks. I think I'd never looked at agriculture from a very wide perspective. I was looking for sustainability most of the time, but I think the sustainability has a much bigger connotation, for the globe, especially agriculture being the largest consumer of energy. In terms of spending energy, whether it's fertilizer, whether it is on-farm energy, and that's where I think a big chunk of money lies actually. You could have a huge saving. Somewhere I was reading, I think it's worth several $1 trillion worth of money sitting there. So how can we make agriculture system sustainable? Again, looking at both localization and globalization. So that would be one of the major challenge. How do you segregate? How do you bring global practices in a localized manner? And that's where I think we are missing out the boat right now. So that's something, we could release a huge amount of money there, which could then go into bringing in more sustainability.
Kiran, I think very important. Good ideas would be to put ideas on the table. Where can you press people to do something? Because otherwise these are thoughts. We need to crystallize them through the process of negotiations, etc.
Yeah. So for example, what we're trying to do here is using nano fertilizers. That's one simple area. If we can prove that this technology actually works, we are cutting down almost 90% of the costs in terms of not only the cost of production but energy costs associated with that. Just one technology, because any intensive agriculture, what we are practicing right now, is using a huge amount of this carbon footprint. So that's one right thing on the table, and that's where some of the practices which we are developing, for example, in India now, Indian government has opened up use of nano fertilizers and things like mycorrhiza, which can bring more sustainability to the agricultural system. How do we take them globally? That's where you need globalization. I'm looking at, before coming here, I used to work for ICRISAT, International Crops Research Institute, and 50% of our footprint was in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And that's even worse, actually. We are much more endowed, well endowed in India or Egypt. If you go to Africa, the lands are so fragile, even the fertilizers are not available, the productivity. So you're doing everything possible to enhance that inputs into agriculture, whether it's through bringing in private sector, how do you empower private sector, do a technology transfer to them so that cheaper technologies can be made available. And that's where I think we in public sector have to play that role. So the key here is localization and globalization. How do you intermix these two to derive the benefits?
Thank you very much. In fact, Excellency, these entire ideas, you mentioned the Convention on Biodiversity, which was also adopted at the same time. But in various ways, I don't know, intentionally or otherwise, I personally think the one on desertification is the one that perhaps we should pay most attention to, given water stress situations, or perhaps the opposite of what we've seen in our parts of the world and other parts of the world. And in terms of how we're going to tackle arid zones and how we're going to take these things forward. Rashmi, Dr. Ghosh, sir, you would like to say something?
Well, first of all, Dr. Mohieldin for his very wide-ranging toward the horizon of how we have come to this situation and some thoughts on how do we go, where do we go from here? Now, you mentioned, Excellency, about annual flows of, say, perhaps $3 trillion to address climate change. There are a number of different numbers, but they all agree on the orders of magnitude. So we are talking of till say 2050 or 2070, we are talking of a country like India, trillions of dollars of incremental investment, and in all the developing countries put together, maybe a couple of $100 trillion. Now, there is no way that this scale of money can be forthcoming, even with the huge stocks of liquidity that are there in the capital markets. These are very large percentages of the GDP of developing countries. And at least in the case of India, we know that we are speaking about incremental investments of the same scale as our annual investments and savings. Which means that any ambitious mitigation target will necessarily run into issues of choosing between the broader sustainability objectives and climate change. Yeah. Now, there are no easy ways out of this situation. But here I'd like to maybe suggest that we should think of reviving the earlier discussions on technology. And what we see now is that under the UNFCCC, the technology mechanism has essentially become a simple facilitation mechanism by a meat seller. Now, that's very good as far as it goes. But if we are talking about reducing costs of technology, again, by orders of magnitude, so that climate action does not seriously impinge on the prospects of sustainable development, we need many global Manhattan projects. And earlier, India, as well as some other developing countries in the UNFCCC, had proposed mechanisms for global collaborative R&D in technology with sharing of the relevant IPRs, of the resultant IPRs. This proposal never got much traction with the developed countries. But I think that the scale of investments that we require, given what we know of technology as it stands today and the prospects of the reduction in cost of technology in the normal course through scale effects and so on, through tinkering with the existing technologies, that it is impossible for the world to meet its climate objectives in terms of net zero by 2050 or whatever. This morning, I received a message from one of our former negotiators, one of India's foremost energy experts, where he pointed to the fact that in the 50 years from 1973 to 2022, the EU has spent several trillions of dollars on addressing climate change mitigation. And it has succeeded in reducing the share of fossil fuels from 87% to 82%. 50 years, several trillions of dollars. And Ambassador Dasgupta, when I related this story to him, he said that, look, 2022 is an estimate because with the Ukraine war, it may well have gone up to 87% by the time the year is out. So the point is that the only scope it seems to me, for making a real breakthrough is a big breakthrough on the technology front with a number of global Manhattan projects focused on particular technology themes. And yeah. And I'm afraid the numbers that we know of the scale of investments required, the rates of growth of developing countries of the world all over, we know that this scale of resources that we need for 2050 to reach net zero by 2050 is not happening. It's all wishful thinking, but it is only possible with very, very major changes in technology.
Your Excellency, like some others around this table, let me say I am a great fan of technological and innovation. After all of this has resulted as a result of the human brain moving us. Let me go it the other way around. Discovering coal and then oil. Having said all this, my apprehension is that it's not just a question of letting off the hook, but I hope that this race for zero doesn't become a case of race for zero by the developing world, and now under various geopolitical explanations. Excellency, would you like to say something at this stage, or should we take a few more comments and questions from colleagues? What would you prefer?
I'm happy to provide
No, please.
quick reactions to the very important points raised thus far by Ambassador Dasgupta. First, on the issue related to finance, yes, the case of the 100 billion reminds me exactly of the case of the 0.7% of GNI that the advanced economies promised the developing economies to deliver. Has a longer history, and it has a longer history of failure as well. Because so far we didn't get more than 1/3 on average in any year. We're using the metric that's being produced by OECD DAC. And we know as well that the 0.7% is not sufficient for development finance, as the 100 billion is not sufficient for the climate finance. I think my argument here is not to get the advanced economies off the hook, but basically a strong message, I would say 3 strong messages in one. First, for those who care about the future of the advanced economies, especially from the younger generations, and they are demonstrating against the mess in the world and the fact that we are drifting from targets, and they are concerned, as they should, about the deterioration of the climate and biodiversity with it as well. They have a bigger task at home when they do that, and they need to be better in terms of getting their efforts together. They need to speak, these younger generations of OECD countries, to their parliaments, to their governments, to their ministers of finance, and to ask them a simple question. Of 23 countries committed themselves voluntarily in 2009 to contribute their fair share to climate finance, why 6 or 7 of them at best managed to reach this figure, while the others are on averages less than 30%? And with the way that I respect public choices in democracies, and sometimes these processes results in governments that may not really be as convinced of the merits of international cooperation like others. But I would say that even in act related to fulfilling self-interest. They need really to deliver on what they promised. Because providing no finance, no technical support in the areas related to climate action will have devastating impact on global stability, on markets, and they are keen to have stable markets, growing markets, and of course, forced migration and asylum seekers forced by deterioration in weather. And we started to see concepts on climate migrants and climate refugees. So that requires this kind of attention. And of course, out of self-respect, I'm not talking about historical commitments, it's recent, as recent as 2009. And we have a figure that we need to think about for 2025. So that I'm not really putting any kind of a simple ways to exit for these advanced economies. But I'm just, through that kind of argument, I'm asking those who care that even if they deliver, it's not really going to be sufficient. The second message is basically for developing economies, emerging markets. That could be, many of them are more capable than the low-income countries and the vulnerable small islands and the vulnerable segments of low-income countries, that they can do a better job in domestic resource mobilization by prioritizing public finance and private finance to provide what's needed, not as a substitute. This is just a way to mobilize every possible source of finance. As they say, every hand on deck just means that others will not really be welcome to participate. The third message, that finance comes with innovation. I'm not fond very much, though that this part of my work, of complicated models of financial innovation. And they do exist. But I'm happy when finance comes with technical assistance, with capacity development, and with concessional terms. And that could be, and that could come with one of the best examples, and I'm relying on your extensive networks, not just at home, but around the world. That one of the most successful means of finance in existence after the Second World War was IDA. This is the International Development Association. That Egypt, before graduation, and India as well, thank you, benefited a great deal from IDA. And this is concessional finance, 10 years grace, so you don't pay anything for 10 years. Interest is around 1.5%, and you pay back in 30 to 40 years. This is the type of finance that if a Minister of Finance asked me as a former government official or as a person who's working with IFIs for many years, I say, well, this could be your best bet. So what could be done there is to extend IDA service to include low-income countries, as it does, but as well, we need to have low middle-income countries. And middle-income countries could benefit, because actually they have a very strong argument here. The majority of the poor around the world are not in low-income countries, they are in middle-income countries.
Yes.
The majority of the extremely poor are in middle-income countries. Egypt has around 39% of its population classified officially, not by international organization, but by the Egyptian government, around 29%. This figure could increase because of COVID. Around 29% are considered as poor, and around 3% or less around to be around the figures to classify them as extremely poor. So this is much more than you get in some of the low-income countries. I agree more. I cannot agree more with what you said on agriculture. It's important. You will be super happy with the agenda because we have an agriculture day. Food security issues are going to be there as well. The nexus between water, food, and energy is reflected. Matters related to enhancing productivity is there. And I think our experts would learn more from matters related to fertilizers and the advanced technologies in this front. As a farmer myself, I'm always looking after the opportunities to get the productivity enhanced. I was happy to see, because we as a farmer, we went from citrus fruit in Egypt to variety of crops, including corn. So I'm happy to see that the productivity that we have per acre is 3 times my grandfather's. But when I went to a farm last week in Virginia, I was surprised that what I celebrate is could be a cause of mourning because of the difference in the productivity per acre of what I produce. The production there is at least 10 times what we produce. Yeah. So this is the ratio, 1 to 10. Huh? Exactly. So yeah, I'm happy with this optimistic note that there is a potential, but the potential will come with exactly what you said, in technology, in investment, in new ways of handling the crops, and of course, as always, Dr. Gauch enlightened us with many aspects on the state of affairs globally and the advancement that Europeans had, and what we can learn from that more. But I took note of that. Thank you so much, Dr. Gauch. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you for focusing on people.
Yeah.
We tend to forget that, especially when it comes to geopolitics.
Yeah.
But people matter, and I think that's important. Excellency, let me request another of our colleagues here, someone that I work very closely with, Suruchi Bhadwal, who would also be there at Sharm el-Sheikh. Yeah, we'll come to Mr. Rashmi. Don't worry, he's got many things to say. So let's ask someone who's going to be in the trenches, at least as far as the think tank community from the developing world is concerned. So,
working with TERI, and just to give a few lines of introduction to the organization, as you rightly said, there are some organizations which are focusing on knowledge generation. So we are a knowledge-based organization, generating information, advancing science on climate change issues, working with a lot of data, analyzing that data, and then processing it to see what relevance we can draw on it with regard to climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. So that's where we sit in terms of the work that we do within the organization, and we've been doing work in a whole array of areas, working with different clients, both bilateral, multilateral, country governments, and at the subnational scales as well, spanning a whole range of actors, including public, private, and international organizations. So that's the scope of work that we have, and the discussion was very interesting for me. Of course, I think the focus on technology, the point that Dr. Ghosh basically raised, and what Ambassador Dasgupta also basically highlighted with regard to climate finance, are crucial elements of any discussion at the international level with regard to climate policy. The only thing that I basically have a view on, and maybe it's a personal view with regard to climate finance, is that any amount of money that you put on the table would actually be less to the scales at which we are talking about in terms of the changes that are required to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And therefore, we need to have a mixed model approach with regard to climate finance. One, of course, with regard to international support that can be made available, but also looking at how we top it up with public finance and private finance to be able to achieve the goals. Because any amount of money that is basically put on the table may not be enough to be able to meet the required action within countries. And therefore, I do feel that there needs to be some discussion on this at the international level also. And possibly we should be very honest in saying the money that the developed countries are putting on the table will just help us catalyze action within countries. It's not going to allow us to, all of us, to adapt or mitigate to the changes that we are talking about and the kind of technology, deployment, that is needed. So that's one with regard to climate finance that I have a view on. But the second view is with regard to the topic that you basically mentioned while you were giving your key remarks on just transitions. And then to be able to achieve all this, of course, you need some time to deliver, and it cannot be done overnight or in a matter of a few years. So when we're talking about just transitions and taking just transitions forward, I think one of the elements that we never discussed is the time that would be required for us to move from A position to B position when we're talking about, achieving these changes. Like the Montreal Protocol, a clear-cut agenda with regard to a phased approach, because while we are talking about net zero and we are talking about goals over some period of time, I think heading towards the net zero goals or the targets that we've kept for ourselves, we need to be very clear in the intermediate phase, what is it that we will be able to achieve with regard to finance and technology in the intermediate period to allow us to mitigate and adapt and deliver on climate actions. And I think just transitions is just not a terminology or a term, but the just transition should be discussed along with the time factor that is required to transition from phase A to phase B. And that element, I think, needs to be also, delved on, during the international discussion. So that's, I think, the second point that I thought I would like to make. And with regard to loss and damage, and of course, I am from the adaptation stream, and I've been following up some of the discussions with regard to loss and damage. I think there's not been much progress internationally, except for the fact that, we are now discussing the possibility of looking at research and dialogue with regard to this area, but compensation and liability is still far away. And I think what we see on the scientific side, the reason why loss and damage is still not being picked up, in the manner it should be, is because of this whole development on the scientific side that we see. And I'm part of the IPCC also, where there's a lot of focus now being given an emphasis on detection and attribution of these events to climate change, just to understand that the events that have occurred in different parts of the world can be attributed clearly to the cause of, an enhanced climatic condition, which is basically now resulting in these events, happening in different parts of the world. So if that science gets strengthened and those kind of assessments get, strengthened, then possibly the links to a direct link to the causality would be established, and the fight for, this whole negotiation that we are having on the loss and damage to provide the compensation would basically be further strengthened. And I think we should focus on basically demanding the scientists to be able to give us the right kind of information and science that can help policymakers and decision makers internationally, nationally, to basically link it all up to be able to drive the agenda on the loss and damage side. So
Rochi, thank you. His Excellency had mentioned data. As far as we are concerned in India, it remains a matter of great priority. Sir, I have to be partial to those on my right. And let me turn to Mr. Rashmi, who has been a fellow traveler and will tell you what it feels to be sitting on the same table with President Obama. But Rashmi, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Manjeev. And Excellency, Copenhagen was a long time ago. A lot of change has taken place. Thank you first for pointing out the holistic nature of sustainability. And that's very reassuring to hear from you, that you will be looking at this in a very holistic manner. So naturally, when we hear the word ambition, and then the Glasgow decisions did talk about continuing this exercise in ambition. So we hope, we are actually in very safe hands when you say that decarbonization is not the only thing you will be looking at, and it has to be holistic in nature. So let me just point out to the agenda that you will be addressing at Sharm el-Sheikh. There are 2 work programs that have been launched, and one is on the long-term finance and one is on the global goal for adaptation. I'm sure a lot of work is going into this. It's a pity that we couldn't hold the meeting in 2020. Otherwise, we would have seen the conclusion of these 2 work programs at Sharm el-Sheikh and would have been very happy. Now, I just wanted to point out 2 things here. One is the long-term finance issue, which Ambassador Dasgupta has referred to, and many others. And you have also mentioned about the scale. The issue, I'm sure, when you're looking at this, we are not looking at only the scale, but also the way in which the climate finance is defined, the scope of climate finance and the speed at which we are able to access the finance. So I think all this entire gamut of the issues will hopefully will be addressed as part of this work program. The fundamental problem is that we have still not agreed on what is climate finance, and that's the reason why there is so much of divergence in the figures which we are hearing. The OECD says that they have already met 80% of the 100 billion target. Our own assessment and assessment in many other developing countries say that even 20% hasn't been met. So one way to avoid this kind of divergence in the assessments is that we agree on a definition of what actually is climate finance, and that could be a part of this the long-term finance work program. And secondly, the structure through which these funds flow. The concession, the difference between the grants and the concessions and all that can be taken care of if we agree on this definition. But the other issue is how do we ensure that it flows fast enough and in a manner that when you said about mobilizing domestic finance. Domestic finance in India, for example, our assessment says that it's almost 80% of the total resources that we are mobilizing for meeting climate needs. So this 80% will need to be scaled up with the assistance that we receive in form of grants or concessional finance. How does that happen? Now, there are some institutions which are in place. GCF is there, but GCF is practically inactive. It's very inadequate. There will be other instruments also need to be put in place. Maybe GCF needs to be strengthened. Certainly under your presidency, I think you'll be looking at this, how to strengthen this current mechanism to be able to ensure that the flows become speedier and the access becomes easier. That is one of the critical issues. Even if we have the finances, we are not able to access them in time and in the manner in which we require it. So maybe you, when you grapple with these issues, if you could ask your people to focus on how the issues relating to how we can create risk mitigation instruments and funds within the existing mechanisms, so that the countries like India, who are in need of scaling up their domestic finance, are able to use those instruments and funds at the disposal of these multilateral and the funds which are governed under the UN, not bilateral or other multilateral funds. So that is the other issue which I'm sure will will engage your attention. The other part was adaptation, to which you referred to, and this is another work program which you will be handling. So obviously, what is it that we can do in terms of global goal for adaptation will be a very, very important goal at Sharm el-Sheikh. And of course, decisions can't be reached there, but a lot of fundamental work can be done. One important issue that we have been facing is that when we talk about adaptation, we only talk about finance. But I think we also need to understand the nature of the work that we do with this financial assistance. Last year, they agreed on doubling up the finance for adaptation. So maybe under your presidency, if they agree on a figure, that will be good enough, but very good, but it will not be good enough. So the other thing which we need to also perhaps decide upon is the nature of the adaptation, the global goal for adaptation. And as you know, in our own country, we have a national action plan on climate change where a number of missions are focused on adaptation, but all of them are implemented at the state level, subnational level. So maybe as part of this global goal for adaptation, we will need to think about a structure where the states and the subnational entities are enabled or strengthened to be able to implement the adaptation. And it doesn't become another GCF kind of a situation where everything is controlled centrally at the global level and the countries don't have a role to play. So the ultimately the success will lie in making it really country-driven or locally led adaptation approaches. So I think at Sharm el-Sheikh, maybe we can't agree on everything, but we can certainly agree on the kind of approaches which we need to follow in terms of the delivering the adaptation goal. That was the second and last point, which I thought I'll just mention in passing, was about the loss and damage, to which my colleague Suruchi has referred to. Again, that is a long drawn process. Unfortunately, we are only talking about Warsaw mechanism and not about the facility for finance. It would be good if we can agree on something like that, which is either a part of GCF or some other multilateral UN institution where this facility is created. And we only, because the recognition of the problem is there, but we don't have resources to really implement this. Again, in the way in which adaptation will be dealt with, we will need to think about how we can strengthen the country's hands to implement this and create a facility for addressing this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Rashmi, thank you very much. Your Excellency, I know that we are kind of running out of time that we had, but Shelly Kedia runs our program for the World Sustainable Development Summit, including matters related to that will be brought by us to Sharm el-Sheikh. So, Shelly, you have the floor for a few minutes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ambassador Puri, and welcome to the delegation. Yeah, just like to flag that firstly, we thank the embassy for facilitating the participation of His Excellency Sameh Shokre, as well as the Environment Minister, Madam Yasmin Paut at the WSDS this year. And we were in, very, very sort of, I would say that we are privileged that we got those very valuable perspectives ahead, while Egypt is the president designate. So again, thank you so much for that. And we do hope, firstly, I'd just like to flag that please block your date for the next WSDS, which is going to be held from 22nd to 24th of February 2023. And this is going to be an in-person summit, and we do hope to have high-level participation from Egypt this year. I'd just like to now go to an initiative that we launched at the last WSDS valedictory session called Act for Earth. And under Act for Earth, we have two major components. One is the COP27 compass, and the other is the SDG charter. We felt both these components are important, considering the fact that you highlighted, Your Excellency, about a holistic approach, considering sustainable development as well as climate action. So COP27 compass was more to kind of highlight the perspectives from the global south. I mean, as we know, a compass by default points to the north, but we do hope that we will be able to collate some perspectives from the global south under this initiative. And we had a stakeholder consultation, which we organized in partnership with the Egyptian embassy, as well as an organization under the National Resource Council called Center for Sustainable Development and Climate Change Research, the C3SD, with whom we are also organizing an event at the COP27 Presidency Pavilion this year at the COP. So just wanted to flag a few findings which we got from this consultation as well as the exercise. Firstly, on the global goal on adaptation, we would need metrics for the global goal on adaptation, and something that can be similar to the SDGs. SDGs itself has gaps because in SDGs, ideally, we should have input indicators, output indicators, as well as outcome indicators. For example, for the global goal on adaptation, we could have, say, universal access to climate information as one of the metrics that all countries can agree on. And, you yourself highlighted the importance of data. And I think this is very important for countries, local entities, as Mr. Rashmi also pointed, to have that universal access to climate information so that there can be climate action in a risk-based approach at all levels. I'd also just like to flag on climate finance yes, it's very good to kind of talk about blended finance and private finance being catalytic to mobilizing finance from other sources when it comes to mitigation, because they're more market responsive. However, let's call it a bluff when it comes to adaptation. We need more grant finance. We need that coming from more public finance sources. So it's very important, and not just in terms of adaptation, but also mitigation. When it comes to vulnerable sectors, for example, MSMEs and agriculture, we have to talk about inclusion and how that climate finance is sourced to these sectors. In a recent study which we did with Suruchi's team, we looked at MSMEs and they are very vulnerable. And we don't have climate finance reaching to them. Where is this climate finance going? So I think this is an important aspect that, that yes, markets are important and they are here to stay and we must leverage markets, as much as we can, but there are also limits to that. So that is where you have to ensure that there is public finance delivery mechanisms as well as grant finance when it comes to climate finance. The other thing is on just transitions. The just transitions, as we see, it is a discursive tool which is used to kind of lobby for the anti-fossil fuel industry, which is fine, well and important in the long term. We all need that. However, inclusive transitions, and as we brought out in our SDG charter, should also look at the energy demand side perspective, because they mean, people are, we have to take everyone around, we have to take everyone with us. No one should be left behind. When we are talking about energy transitions or just transition in MSMEs, in agriculture sector, it's not just about just transitions in fossil fuel dependent communities, but it is also on the energy demand side. So this is one aspect we think is a very major gap when it comes to just transitions. And why not apply just transitions to adaptation? At the end, what Suruchi flagged, when you're moving from stage 1 or phase 1 to phase 2, there are transitions involved and there is a chance that it may not be just. So that is very important, that just transition has to move from mitigation and the anti-fossil fuel to adaptation as well. Finally, I'd just like to say, when it comes to the holistic approach, we did a policy brief under the COP27 Charter on Global Commons. Now, the thing is, one thing about the Glasgow Pact, which was encouraging, was the inclusion of oceans in a very strong way. So what we feel is, yes, we're talking about a larger integration of the Rio Conventions, the CBD, the CCD, with UNFCCC, but also let's talk about the marine-related conventions, the UNCLOS. There are, because at the end, they're all linked to climate change. We have seen from the IPCC reports how oceans are going to get affected and how oceans can also contribute to the solution. So we have to go beyond the Rio Conventions to link and bring greater synergies with other conventions and so this is just in brief what we found in the COP27 compass, which we feel, we wanted to send, share this message with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelly. Your Excellency, the last colleague of ours, Arup Malik, to give you a bit of the perspective of what business in India thinks. So we are talking about implementation. After all, at the end of the day, if they're not on board or if they're not active players, what exactly are we talking about? So Arup, a few minutes if you don't mind, but please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador, and Excellency. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. I and some colleagues have also heard you speak at the Africa Climate Week, and the inspiration that you throw while you are at the panel and speaking is something that's infectious. Is one word that comes to my mind. We have been we have been privileged to be working with the COP champion, also with Nigel topping earlier. And what we would so there are a set of, like Ambassador Puri mentioned, there are a set of interventions that we are looking at to be at COP27 with you. On the 3 days that we are looking at the presidency themes, on the 9th of November on the Finance Day, on the 11th of November on the Industry Decarbonization Day, and on the 15th of November the Energy Day, and the 16th on the Solutions Day. And our 1-point proposal would be, under your leadership, like the other race campaigns that you have, if we can also have a race to light campaign. And when I say race to light, it is more to create lighthouse projects on some of the technologies that Ambassador Puri, Dr. Ghosh, Ambassador Dasgupta have been mentioning. And our argument would be that, can we have these lighthouse projects in India, in Egypt, in the developing world? Because increasingly what we are also seeing is, like we have the SFDR in the European Union, we have the business responsibility and sustainability reporting guidelines in India. And likewise, there is something at the Johannesburg for the Johannesburg stock exchanges as well. So if we can, the holistic idea of sustainability through these frameworks that are more local in nature. So how we can use these frameworks to build more investor confidence is something that would be key for us to look at new channels of financing, new channels of global technology partnerships for more action and for implementation. At our forums that we are doing with the industry players, where the Indian industry colleagues and the CXOs would be there, we would love to have you join them and you to speak to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you. Your Excellency, we've done something big in Glasgow on the question of industry's involvement globally within India, etc. And there are a number of examples of large industries in India in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors, which have been global champions. We are very proud of that. But Excellency, your minder here is looking at me. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. We'd be happy to hear your comments and want to thank you very much for the time that you found for us.
Thank you so much. As expected, that be a very useful meeting for me, and I hope that's not just useful for me alone, but with the kind of interaction with you, I learned a lot. And let me just provide quick reactions to what you shared. And I'm happy that some of the issues came in different ways with the four speakers at the end. The just transition, yes, it's good to have a time framework. As we always being reminded, when it comes, especially in issues related to energy, it's not time alone. It's technology, finance, and the ability of the labor market to adjust with that. If we have that all together, we can really agree on the time frame. But yeah, I'm with you on this. And just could be one of these subjective descriptions to matters that at the end of the day, we know what it means, but we need really to have a good metric attached to what we mean by just, because different cultures, different perspective can dilute as well the meaning across borders. So perhaps we need to have some sort of concrete definition, not philosophical ones, but practical ones, because normally we're dealing with governments and business sector in this area. And as far as we can really have some specific targets, as we are trying to do, that would be great to have. One of the most celebrated projects coming out from Glasgow last year, you may remember, is the South African project on phasing out from coal, phasing in renewables, and adhering to the just transition because it dealt with the impact of the local community. Beyond the progress of this project that I know is still trying to get itself on track, but at least it had the elements of what could be just there, including finance, including compensation for those who could be impacted, including training. So it's a very much complex notion. It could be resolved more at project base, but it needs to have the good policy and good regulations behind it. We are, and in the decarbonization sessions and COP, you'll be finding a lot of discussion about that. On the climate finance, yes, I think you mentioned that in different ways. I agree. The 80% by OECD is 20% by Oxfam, measuring the same 100 billion. So this tells you something about the metric. And that could be something that we can benefit from in the future finance, not in the old finance arrangements when we are talking about post-2025. This is one of the issues that Nixon and Verasonghi had been mandated to do by the presidency of COP27 and COP26 included in that. And the report will be shared on the 24th of October, and it's going to be presented in during the COP. So I think it would have some interesting elements to discuss, including metrics, especially that Nixon was behind the notion of economics of climate change, and the 100 billion came out from discussion, although that in many discussions that I had with him, he said that he insisted that the 100 billion should be easily defined and should be public finance to public finance recipients. So it's public finance donors to public finance recipients, and then to be disseminated adequately to private sector. But we know now from the practice that anything, forgive the word, anything thrown from the north to the south is being considered as part of the 100 billion. And that's why you get this kind of discrepancy, and we need to have a better understanding of the definition for us to measure it better going forward. But this is being included adequately in our discussions on finance and the prospects of finance. Loss and damage. We hope that the discussions led by Chile and Germany, as requested by the Minister of Foreign Affairs in his capacity as president of the COP, is going to be progressing. Because, as I say, sometimes I don't mean to offend anyone, but sometimes words come out naturally. Say the loss and damage is lost in endless discussions. And for us as catalysts, as coordinators of the work, as non-state actors, we cannot really go beyond what the state actors and the ambassadors here know this. They design the framework, and within that framework, we can work. We cannot go ahead and implement things that are not in the mandates. Otherwise, we'll be accused of crossing borders, trespassing, not respecting the mandate. We cannot do it. That's why you see the work of the non-state actors, including the business sector, is very advanced, relatively speaking. We didn't reach what we should be reaching. We need to do multiples of that in areas related to mitigation and decarbonisation, including in the hard-to-abate sectors and the first movers, because the system is there, the business logic is there, incentives are in place, so you get the non-state actors do their good work. But the loss and damage is basically in a very obscure area now, and we need really to have better understanding beyond the general words that came in the Paris Agreement. And actually, these general words were complicated by the many provisions put against them by the advanced economies. So we hope to see some progress, and this is one of the areas that we look for some sort of progress in Sharm. Adaptation, it's a priority area, as you would subscribe to this issue in India, in many sectors, in many regions dependent, rural development and agriculture. Adaptation is big. In our case, in Africa as well. So lots of good ideas, and that's why you see the agriculture, food systems, water management, adaptation as well in the infrastructure, including in the urban areas impacted by weather and climate changes. But to have a target, I think that would be a very brave thing to do. And I encourage you to insist more on it. You'll be confronted by challenge because of simple minds sometimes control the discussion. Nothing against simple minds if their recommendations work, but they don't need to limit others to do more complex work. Mitigation is being appreciated everywhere with our assumption if you reduce emission in India, the impact will be felt in Iceland, and vice versa. Adaptation have been seen, and wrongly so, as a kind of localized effort. But we know now that adaptation could really have its own spillovers across borders, especially if you don't do it. If you do it, that would be great, and it will have positive spillovers. If you don't do it, it will have something similar to what I mentioned about when it comes to the loss and damage. So some good researchers, and you have many of them, they need really to make the case of the global impact or external impact of a decent adaptation project that could be conducted in Gujarat, for instance. That would be great, because we need more anecdotal evidence, and then hopefully more journal evidence substantiated by science and dissemination of this information to tell those who are concerned that your finance of adaptation is not of less important than your finance of mitigation, especially that we are going to be always relying on public finance for adaptation, because the private sector contribution in many jurisdictions that we tested, including the whole African continent, is less than 3% out of $11.4 billion spent on adaptation. Only 3% came from private sector. And I think I'll talk to my colleagues, because I asked for these aggregated figures of the 3%. I'm trying to find the hope even in the smallest of things. And when they gave me this aggregated definition, it's more of philanthropies, institutional investors and pension funds, not really your typical business sector or private sector, not your the colleagues that you are working with, but more of non-profit organizations and long-term institutional investors supported by government finance. So here we need to do more work on that. Again, I'm happy with what you said now in the business sector, and the business sector will be super busy, not just with the non-state actors activities and events, but by many joint events as well, including the action, the pavilion. My colleague here is taking notes as well of your kind invitation. And if you can exchange with me and with her as well, contact information, I'm happy with colleagues to be there. My final plea that sometimes in finance, and I spent all of my life trying to understand some things about it, climate or development finance or finance at large, people are fond of new vehicles, of new bottles, while we are talking about the same old wine. I don't mind having new vehicles if they are attractive, especially to the younger generation of some of the innovative investment banks or anything like that. But money is money at the end. We need to get this kind of money flowing to the projects, especially where they matter more. Until they get better vehicles for financing climate action, the money that should be coming from the advanced economies should be of concessional forms and less debt and less loans to developing economies. Again, I'm repeating this issue of let's use IDA standards unless we have something better. The beauty of it that it has been tested for many years. It is more democratized because the beneficiaries and the donors are at the same table, and it has a private sector window, and it is super fast in dissemination. It's not like some of the funds that you apply for the money today and you get it in 2025 if you are lucky. So let's use some of the existing, and when I say IDA, it doesn't mean that you only work with the World Bank. I'm talking about IDA principles. Even if the Asian Development Bank or African Development Bank use these principles, they are going to be more than welcome. But to continue, given that you raised finance many times, to continue with the current structure and architecture of finance, as insufficient as it is, as inefficient as it is, and unfair as it is, that will not really get us in any better position if you have this discussion before COP28, not COP27. Thank you.
Excellency, thank you very much. That was extremely comprehensive, very clear, and I must thank you very much for finding the time for us. Excellency, in the famous discussions on this 100 billion, people forget there was another figure called 30 billion. And if you recall, there is a word called approaching written before 30 billion. We are still in the business of approaching. And I'm afraid that's a reality that many of us need to internalize. But Excellency, I want to end this by referring to something that you mentioned, which is it behoves all of us in the developing world to also get back to the world, which includes the developed world, that adaptation is not about only us. It is also about you, including what we do. And let me give you simple examples, vector-borne diseases. And let me give you a much more difficult one, migration. I think just as much as the pressure needs to be kept on them, collaborative actions are required. The group of 77, the developing countries, all need to be strong in their pitch and their imperatives. They also need to be, let me say, sharp, which is also a need of the hour, because geopolitics would allow people to speak about several other matters instead of addressing what is truly the matter germane and which will impact all of us, them included, very soon, perhaps faster than what we anticipate. Your Excellency, thank you very much for coming. We have in this campus several centers which deal with technologies for sustainability. And I am glad that you're going to visit some of them, although they are short visits, but to leave with you the thought of TERI as an organization. So we are more than 1,000 people, researchers in hard sciences, in sustainability, in policy frameworks across the country. So this would give you an idea of the kind of work that's taking place in India, work that actually possibly will change things even at the grassroots level. Thank you very much, Excellency, for your time. Mr. Ambassador, most grateful to you for having scheduled TERI as part of His Excellency's visit. We want to thank your two colleagues here for being with us and wish you all the very best. COPs are a massive undertaking. That much I can tell you after having been at many of them. I can only imagine that it'll roll on and become an even more gigantic one. But Excellency, wish you, your country, all the very best.